This videotape, which is one in a series, is intended for interpreters, students, educators, parents, and members of the deaf community. It is designed to provide the viewer with a better understanding of multiculturalism and diversity in the American deaf community. The presenter on this videotape has generously agreed to share her experiences and perspectives of being both deaf and a member of a minority. The experiences expressed by the presenter on this tape are her own. They are not necessarily representative of the experiences of members of the same minority group. The presenter's experiences are highly personal and are to be respected. They are not meant to denigrate or insult people with different experiences. The presenter's willingness to participate in this videotape series is greatly appreciated. We hope that the viewer will watch this videotape with an open mind and will respect the presenter's individual experiences and perspectives.
My name is Jessica Lee. I would like to tell you some of my background being a deaf Asian woman and the multicultural aspects of that. I was born deaf, and my parents were unaware of that fact until I was 2 years old. And they were unsure of what to do with me academically. And some people had recommended that I go to an oral school. You need to remember that this was in the 60s, early 70s, and there was a strong support of the oral tradition or total communication. So I was put into an oral school where I learned to speech read on a daily basis. I don't remember what all of that entailed, to tell you the truth. Thinking last year, I'm trying to remember exactly where this took place, but I went to a conference, I think it was in Oregon. I was an exhibitor for my work, Gallaudet University. We had a table there, and a woman showed me a picture of myself with a teacher. And just so happened that this was my old teacher, whose name was Nancy. Her hair had become gray after all of these years. And I was looking at this picture, and I remembered her being so young and beautiful, wearing clothes that were representative of the 60s. And here I'd run into her 30 years later. And at that time, she taught the oral method. And I didn't know what she was supporting at this point in her history. But all of a sudden, I realized she could sign, and we hugged. And I asked her, "You used to support the oral approach, and now have you switched to sign, and why have you done that?" And she said, she talked about how she had graduated from a teaching program, and they taught about how important speech reading and oralism was for deaf students, and that was the belief of the time. And she mentioned how, as she was teaching, she realized that the kids were not getting enough access to education and information. And she talked to various people about what she should do, and they mentioned that she might try sign language. And there was a period of time where she had went from signed English to ASL, and here she was, these 30 years later, having gone through a metamorphosis in her educational teaching styles. I'd like to get back now to my education that I was talking about before. I was placed in an oral school for my first 2 years, kindergarten and first grade, and then I was placed in another program. I need to let you know that I went around to 7 or 8 different schools because my parents were never satisfied with my education, and they were always looking for a better placement. So I went to the first school, the kindergarten and first grade program that was strictly oral. Went to the second program that was oral mostly but allowed a little bit of signing, and my parents were not satisfied with that. And the third program had a strong belief in the philosophy of total communication, and my parents saw some improvement, but they did realize there was a separation between the hard of hearing group and the deaf group. And I was in the hard of hearing group, and I didn't have the exposure to sign language on a daily basis that the deaf kids did. Most of the time in the group that I was in, we just didn't have that kind of exposure. And really, I have to say that the system that was in place there, not anything explicit, but the system that was in place taught me that deaf people were inferior. My parents really wanted me to be placed in a hearing classroom, and I didn't realize that there would be a difference, and I thought, okay, that would be fine with me. And so one day my parents did decide to talk with the principal and negotiate for me to be put into a hearing classroom. The principal approved that, and of course I was taken aback. I was the only deaf person in an entirely hearing environment. I had to read lips every day of the teacher or my fellow students, and my eyes were totally worn out, if you could imagine. I'd get home and was not allowed to play. My parents had hired a private tutor for me after school, so that was another part of giving up the social aspects of my life. But they wanted me to improve academically. In a way, my parents were trying to help me by hiring a tutor. And if my parents had learned sign a long time ago, perhaps that would have been a benefit. But at that time, as I said, they thought that oralism was the way to learning how to read and write English in the proper manner. My parents weren't satisfied with that classroom, and I think I was about in my 6th grade year. So in the fall, I had been placed in that mainstream classroom, and then in January they pulled me out and put me in another school. There was no support services whatsoever in this new system. It was a Catholic school for girls, and they had high academic expectations for all the girls that were there. But remember, I was the only deaf child in the classroom. There was a student-to-teacher ratio of 1 to 8. And I had to lip read all day and then study so much at night because there were volumes of homework. And I was there for 4 years, and looking back, I could say, yes, I did enjoy some of the aspects of doing that, but I missed out a lot in classroom discussions. If I was sitting one-on-one with a person, I could catch on to what was going on, but no, group discussions were not something that I could participate in, and I always felt left out. And the teachers afterwards, after class, would come and make sure that I understood everything so that I could appropriately do my homework and learn, but it took a lot of time, a lot of extra time. During that 4 years, I was curious about going to another school where they might have offered support services and had more hearing-impaired children to associate with, because I had grown up pretty isolated. It was a public school, and they did offer support services, and I was thrilled to go there, so my parents placed me there. I was a sophomore, as I recall. It was nice. The teachers were nice. There was several other deaf pupils there. It was a huge school, 2,000 students, if you can imagine. But I was very relieved to be there. There were many kids there, especially boys, because I had gone to the parochial school before. I didn't have to wear uniforms with the skirts and the blouses and blouses with a collar and these brown shoes that I had to wear on a daily basis. Plus, we carpooled every day. And when my parents would take their turn in the carpool, we had a station wagon, but it was green. And I have to tell you where I lived, which was in the Northwest, there was green trees and a green carpool, and our uniforms were green, and I was just overwhelmed by green. I don't mind green so much anymore, but I didn't like green at that time. So I was thrilled, again, to go to the public school. There were people there who could sign, other students that could sign. So my self-esteem was increasing. And I was starting a little bit to recognize my deaf identity. One of the negative things was that the teacher was a teacher/interpreter. She wasn't a certified interpreter. She was a certified teacher. But she had too many job duties. She was /interpreter/tutor/teacher, and I think that she was involved in too many aspects of my life. I had to spend the entire day with her. She would teach a class, and then she would be one-on-one with me as a tutor, and then she would be my interpreter for other classes, and that kind of made me crazy. I'd rather have a teacher who is a teacher, an interpreter who is an interpreter, and a tutor who is a tutor. But to have all three in one was disconcerting to me. I soon was going to be a senior, and I wanted it to be the best memory for myself. So I was considering going to a deaf school. But let me back up for a moment. Previously in my life, when my parents would ask me if I wanted to go to a residential school for the deaf, I always thought of it as a reform school. I never wanted to attend. And then I had met some friends at a summer program. They had a camp every year, and I met several deaf friends who had come from residential schools and mainstream programs as well. And my parents always wanted me to concentrate on my academics as opposed to socializing. And that's a cultural thing from my family. Let me get back to where I was going. So I decided at one point that I wanted to go to a deaf school, and having said no all of these years, I was figuring, how could I convince my parents that I needed to go to a deaf school? So I called the deaf school and had them send me an application and some information about the school. I read in the application and the information that they offered like a part-time mainstream program along with the residential program. And so I showed it to my parents, and they negotiated with me a deal that I could go for a semester to the deaf school and then go back and graduate from the public school. And so I was thrilled. But I have to tell you, I had a different idea about what a deaf school looked like. I was pretty naive at the time. I didn't really realize that I'd be living in a dorm. I didn't realize it was so far from my parents' home. It was about a 3-4 hour drive south from where I live. It just never occurred to me. All I could think about was the fact that my friends would be there, and that there would be teachers who could sign, and that I'd have full access to communication. But I didn't realize some of the other things. And then I got there, and as I said, it was so far from my home and living in the dorms. I have to tell you, before stepping foot on that campus that day, I had never seen a deaf school. And the buildings were rather old when I got there that first day, and I was a little concerned about that. But as my friends approached me, it didn't matter anymore. I was just so happy to see them, and it's such a wonderful experience for me looking back. I had communication. There was deaf culture that I acquired while I was there. People could sign. It was such a positive experience. One of the negative aspects about going to the residential school was that I had to be at the residential school for some classes and then at the public school for other mainstream classes. And I got my academics from the mainstream program and my socialization from the deaf school. I did have an interpreter, but they weren't certified. And I wish during that time that a deaf adult or a deaf advocate or somebody would have told my parents that your daughter really has the right to have a certified interpreter. They didn't know. I didn't know. And today, it's very important that children have the right, and they know that they have the right to have certified interpreters. And I'm going to go more into that issue at the end of my discussion. So at the end of the semester, my parents saw how happy I was, and they allowed me to graduate from the deaf school as opposed to going back to a mainstream program. And I did graduate from that program. And I went to Gallaudet to receive my Bachelor's of Science in Business Administration. And then I went to get my master's at Boston University, and I became a teacher after that from a graduate program there. That's my educational background in a nutshell. My father worked at a hospital. He was a physician. And he would come home. Let me think about the setup of the table. We had a large round table. My father would sit at the head of the table. My mother would sit at the opposite end. And the children, the four of us, would sit on opposite sides of each other. Meals were very fascinating. My father always had Korean food. My mother always had Mexican food. And we always had a variation of other things there. Cooking was big in my family, and I remember my mother made great tasting food. And let me explain what the communication looked like. The whole family could speak English. Say if my mother and brother were having a fight, she would speak in Spanish, and my father had no idea what was going on. He, of course, knew that they were speaking Spanish, but he couldn't understand the communication between the two of them. Say if my mother and father wanted to have a private conversation, they would speak in Korean to one another, and none of us were included in that conversation. And then other times they would speak English. A lot of times in group discussions I was lost. And they would say, I'll fill you in later. And I know that many deaf people have had the same experience. And some people who come from deaf families have had the experience of signing ASL at the dinner table. I was always the first person to leave the dinner table, interestingly enough. I think that the communication amongst the family was very important, but I still missed things. Even just recently at Christmas, I missed some things. And I try not to make a big scene about feeling left out. I know that someone will catch me up later on in a one-on-one conversation, my mother in particular. But I want to be in the moment so many times, and I really had the inability to do that. And that kind of thing happens. Talking about my parents, they wanted to improve my hearing all the time. I used to refer to myself as hearing impaired or hard of hearing. I never called myself deaf. And at that time, they didn't recognize big D, little d deaf. So I consider myself hearing impaired. My parents always wanted the best for me. And I understand that they meant well for my education and my life. I understand why they did it. But they always wanted the best hearing aids and the best of everything to improve my ability to hear. That was one of the hidden messages or meta messages that I got from my parents, that would make them happy if I could hear. They were trying to find a cure for me to become hearing. So I went through several things. Maybe some other deaf people have had similar experiences, but as you know, my father was a physician, and he could speak Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, and English. And he knows several cultures well. And he knew a Chinese herbalist. And he was thrilled to bring him home. He warned me about it, and I didn't exactly know what he was doing. I was a little nervous about it, because I need to let you know, even the mention of the name of this stuff brings back horrible memories for me. So this herbalist brought over a flask with herbs in it, and they mixed water inside, mixed with the herbs, and they boiled it. And it was brown and muddy looking, and it tasted so terrible. And I was like, what is this for? And it's like, it's going to make you better, Jessica. And I didn't want to do it. But I really didn't have a choice because I couldn't talk back to my parents. So I forced it down. I had to drink like 2 glassfuls of it every day for, I believe it was like 2 weeks. It didn't work, of course, but after that 2 weeks, I was so relieved to get it over with. Another thing that they tried was acupuncture. I'm sure you're familiar with the use of needles and pressure points in your ears for back problems or different problems. But they thought it was going to make me be able to hear. I think I had that treatment for 1 or 2 months. Plus, they used some electronic acupuncture, which was awful, and I wouldn't want to go through that again. But I think I did that for about 2 months, and my parents were thinking, oh, that doesn't work. Okay, we better move on to something else. And then another time, I had different tutors and interpreters as I was growing up. And one of my tutors' husband was a pastor, and she asked me if I was interested in being faith-healed at a church. And I thought, why not? So I was taken to church, and they laid their hands upon me. It didn't work. So they tried several different things, and they all failed. And I had really had enough of the cures. My self-esteem was kind of ruined by that. My identity was. I didn't really know who I was or where I stood. And relating to my identity as a deaf person, that really means a lot to me. It's such an important aspect to me, being a big D deaf person. I have one person to thank, one woman whose name is Marie Jean Phillip. She's very well known, was very well known in the deaf community as an advocate for the deaf. She educated with the bilingual, bicultural method. She did a lot of workshops, conferences, meetings, all sorts of things related to ASL and English, and that ASL is truly a language. She passed away a year ago, was it? Or 2 years ago. My goodness, how time flies. And if it wasn't for Marie, I don't think I'd be here this minute talking on a videotape with you. I don't know where I would be now without her influence. Let me talk about the biggest impact of my life as a deaf person and identifying as a deaf person. But let me hang on to that for a moment and let me back up to growing up, my childhood. I didn't really understand about deafness, hard of hearingness, all those things. People would just call me hard of hearing because I could speak, and I just took on that label. I said, that's what I am, okay, then whatever, and I took it on as I was growing up. Then I moved to Boston, Massachusetts. Even thinking about it, I remember those experiences so warmly. The energy that went on in that city for me. I was naive when I moved there. I had graduated from Gallaudet University and I was looking for a job. I moved to Boston. I worked at a school called the Learning Center for Deaf Children. I thought I'd make friends there. I thought it was a great opportunity for me to go to Boston. I was always curious about Boston. I was going to be working a graveyard shift for the program. I didn't know anyone when I moved there. And I was working one night, and a short, stocky woman with curly hair and glasses came up and introduced herself as Marie Phillip, and I told her I was working graveyard, and she said, I've worked nights before, and you'll tend to get tired, and if you need any assistance on tips for staying awake, let me know. And that was how I met her. She worked, seemed to me, all the time. She was always reading things or doing things for the school. She gave her life to the Learning Center. She wholeheartedly believed in the bicultural, bilingual method. She worked with the parents, the community, the children. It was all-encompassing for her. And I didn't realize what an important person she was at the time I met her. I was just some little old deaf person, and I had met this really powerful woman. So one night I was having a hard time staying awake, and I remembered what she had told me, and that she had several books and magazines in her office. And I worked upstairs, and her office was downstairs, and I asked her, I went down and said, Marie, help me to stay awake. What am I going to do? And she recommended I read a book. And that book really opened my eyes. And I'm trying to remember the exact title. It was called Seeing Voices by the author Oliver Sacks. And I just dove into this book. The book talked about the hearing world versus the deaf world, language, and all of the things that it entails. And I would go to her and ask her what it meant. Now remember, I worked nights, and we had an hour where we had a crossover so I could ask her many of these questions. And she always took the time to spend with me, this fresh new graduate coming from an educational system that really seemed to have failed me. And I was just so fascinated. So she asked me if I wanted to come see what went on during the day. So I went and did some volunteering during the day. And then I decided to go to Boston University. And I really enjoyed it. And I was deciding that I might want to become a teacher. And that was the beginning for me. And Marie was one of the people who saw how much I changed and went from little d to big D deaf. One of the courses that was required for my master's degree was psychology and deafness. The professor for that class was Ben Bahan. So I learned from his lectures, talking about the schools, teachers, systems, and so on. Nothing really hit me, though. And then one topic came up, talking about mainstream school programs and residential programs, and the pros and cons of both. The social development, the emotional development, academic development, and comparing the two systems and what was lacking from one system and what was included in other systems. And they talked about the research of teachers using total communication and the teachers who totally used American Sign Language and nothing else. And I realized all of a sudden that I had missed so much growing up. And as he was lecturing on the pros and cons, I just got this picture of my classrooms, and I was overwhelmed with emotion, and I just woke up. I had missed 18 years of education. My life as a normal deaf person was not normal. Other people who had graduated from a residential school looked at me and didn't really realize what I was going through, and I asked them if they had missed a lot, and they didn't really understand what I was talking about. I was trying to talk about what I had missed. It didn't really impact a friend of mine who was in the class with me. I missed so much, and I had been oppressed, it seemed, for all those years by the system, and at that moment, I was enlightened. And that's how my healing started. And Marie saw me through that time and encouraged me and helped me with my identity. Talking about hearing values and deaf values and the comparison and trying to separate them out instead of letting them meld together. It was a difficult time for me because I was so confused. I had so many hearing beliefs and norms and values inside me, and I was trying to wade through them to decide which ones I wanted to choose. I couldn't be for both worlds. I saw the hearing world had in my view, damaged my life, and the deaf world was something that I had missed out on, the communication and the language and the organizations that they had had, and I thought, why had I been oppressed for so long by hearing people? I will never become hearing. And I didn't realize that ASL was going to be my first language, that English was my second language. And that was explained to me, that ASL would be my first language and English would be a second language that I would read and write. And they had just tried to brainwash me into thinking in the public schools that English was my first language, and I had that enlightening experience, and Marie helped me through it. She really saved me. I had another friend named Pat in graduate school, and Marie actually saved our friendship, I think. We were in that same psychology class. And I was talking to her about the impact it had had on me, and it really didn't impact her. And I was so angry, and Pat didn't really understand where I was coming from or what was going on with me. I think of myself as going through this mainstream system that really had a bad effect on me. Pat, of course, went through a mainstream program too, but she didn't feel the same way that I did. And I talked with Marie and said, Pat doesn't really understand me. She doesn't understand what's going on with deaf identity and the oppression. And Marie says, you need to take time to think about your experiences and separate them. Maybe you're going at this too quickly. And she was so supportive and helpful for me to get through that time. And let me back up one thing Marie said. She said, you know, Pat came to see me before you came in here. I didn't realize that. I was kind of shocked. And she said, yeah, Pat and I were talking. She didn't really know how to handle you. You were so upset. You kind of lost it. You were angry. And the course seemed to be such a simple thing. And so Marie explained to Pat that I was going through a hard time and going through a process, and that it wasn't really going to hit Pat in the same way, but that she needed to support me. And so Marie was explaining to Pat that it had nothing to do with her or my education or anything. It always was coming from within, and that I needed to get through some of this oppression that I had felt. And it was a long road, but I know now where I stand, and I can accept hearing people. At that moment, I was very rejectful of hearing people or anything to do with hearing people, music or anything. And it took me a long time to kind of settle back down, because anything hearing, in my perception, had oppressed me and destroyed my life. Teachers who were hearing, interpreters who were hearing, I was thinking, how dare they come into the deaf world? And I really didn't understand the implications of that. But it was part of the process of identity for myself. As a minority, people go through that, gay people go through that, Hispanic people go through oppression. All of us have gone through oppression, and you become angry, and then you start to understand things more clearly. And now I have accepted the hearing world and the deaf world, and I can work with hearing people, but we need to have a balance here. There's a group of well-intentioned hearing people that want to improve deaf children's lives by cochlear implants, oral education, and other methods of communication. There's another group who supports a full bilingual, bicultural education with qualified, certified interpreters. And the history of deaf education, I certainly can't go into that right now, but I suggest that if you are interested in becoming a teacher, that you read up on the history of deaf education. There are several books that will help you understand that. One in particular is called Journey into the Deaf World by 3 authors. Ben Bahan, who, as I mentioned before, was my professor. Bob Hoffmeister, who is the graduate director at Boston University. and another gentleman named Harlan Lane. And Harlan Lane also wrote another book that I'm trying to remember the title of, called The Mask of Benevolence. And that Journey into the Deaf World book is very comprehensive, and it's a great way, if you want to become involved with the lives of the deaf community, to learn more about that. So that kind of summarizes my journey into the big D deaf world. If it was not for Marie Phillip, I'd still be a small D person. I may be working in a shopping mall somewhere. Because as I said before, I had a degree in business administration, so I would have missed a lot of the deaf world. I wouldn't know a thing about it. So I really am grateful to Marie for giving me that. Being a member of an ethnic minority, I really consider myself big D deaf. There are other aspects of my life that are important to me, such as being a Korean woman, the Mexican cultural aspects that are included in my life. But the most important part to me is the communication and being a big D deaf person. Certainly, I adore the Korean community and the foods and the culture that comes with that. You need to understand, I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, and there were no other Asian deaf children around me. Periodically, I'd run into other deaf children, but mostly I was isolated. My father was the president of a state association of Koreans, and he was very active in that. But there were no other deaf children involved in that. So I was quite lonely. I think that really influenced me. I'm certainly proud to be Korean. That's who I am. It's part of me. The Mexican culture that I learned from my mother is very important, and her family, and the gatherings that we had with her family are still a part of me. And they always will be. And I'm proud of that culture. And I'm proud of my father's traditions and cultures as well. But for me, being a big D deaf person is so important. You remember now, I was born in America, influenced by American culture as well. My parents immigrated to America, so I was the first generation born in America. Other Asians who move from their own home country to here have brought their cultures with them, and I really envy that. A lot of times they've had the challenges of having to learn and read English and ASL and all that is American. And we don't have a lot in common. I can't remember which year it was exactly, but they had the first National Asian Conference in San Francisco, California. And I saw the advertisement for that, and I thought, what a great opportunity. I was hoping to meet other deaf Asians who had something in common with me. It was a 3-day convention, and I did enjoy the workshops and meeting people, but I wasn't really satisfied with the connections made with a lot of those people. Several of the people had immigrated from other countries here, and there was a few of us who had been born in America. So it was hard to connect 100% with some of those people who had immigrated here. We connected on the issue of food and communication, but our experiences had been different. In closing, I'd like to say that I have really enjoyed sharing my life experiences with you. Remember, these are my experiences as a deaf woman growing up, and that members of the deaf community have very varied experiences with oppression, but that this is my experience. I want that members of the deaf community and myself work in partnership to improve the education of deaf children. Last of all, I would like to dedicate this videotape to the memory of Marine Jean Phillip. And thanks so much. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.